ready to dive deep. Today, it's Afghanistan. And wow, what a pick a nation marked by count them, two major interventions by global superpowers.
Really gets you thinking, right?
Totally. We're talking the Soviet Union in '79 and then the U.S. in 2001. Same region of the world, but completely different historical playing fields.
Like listening to a song, same melody, but totally different genres, you know what I mean?
Absolutely. It's mind-boggling. On one hand, we've got the Cold War with its ideological tug-of-war.
Right.
And then, bam, 9/11 happens, and it's a whole new ballgame, a global fight against terrorism.
What's fascinating is how, even though both of these interventions happened in Afghanistan, their motives were totally different. Really shows you how global politics can completely transform in just a few decades.
Yeah, it's like understanding the why behind each of those interventions is the key to unlocking this whole story.
Couldn't agree more. So you have the Soviet Union, and for them, going into Afghanistan was like a classic Cold War power move.
Oh.
Think of it like a giant chessboard. They were all about expanding their influence, propping up socialist governments wherever they could.
So Afghanistan was like a strategically important square on that chessboard.
Precisely. Control over Afghanistan, it gave them a route to the Middle East. Think oil, lots of oil, and they could flex their muscles right under the U.S.'s nose. Don't forget, every single move back then was seen through the lens of that Cold War rivalry.
Right, right. It sounds like even before the Soviets got there, Afghanistan was kind of already a tense place.
Oh, absolutely.
There was the Socialist Party, the PDPA, trying to push through all these reforms. But let's just say it wasn't exactly smooth sailing.
The PDPA's reforms were a huge shock to a very traditional conservative society. I mean, they were trying to redistribute land, push for secularization, even champion women's rights.
Whoa.
Yeah. For a lot of Afghans, that was too much change too fast. You know, it disrupted their whole way of life.
So what happened?
Well, you had unrest, armed resistance popping up everywhere, groups like the Mujahideen.
Ah, the Mujahideen. They become pretty important in this whole story, don't they?
Oh, they're key players for sure. The Mujahideen, they were this really diverse group, but they were all united by one thing: opposing the PDPA government. Those reforms, they saw them as a direct threat to their traditional values and way of life.
So the Soviets see this internal conflict brewing, and they think, perfect timing, opportunity.
Well, more like, uh-oh, threat at our doorstep. They were terrified of losing an ally in the region. They couldn't risk Afghanistan, drifting towards the U.S. sphere of influence, so they decide to invade in '79. It was all driven by that Cold War paranoia, a preemptive move to keep control.
Gotcha. So the Soviets, they were all about Cold War maneuvering, securing their little corner of the world.
Right.
But then fast forward a couple decades, and the world is rocked by 9/11. Everything changes.
Yeah, in 2001, the U.S. intervention, it was a direct response to that horrible event. You gotta remember, at that time, the Taliban were in control of Afghanistan. And guess who they were harboring? Al-Qaeda, the group behind 9/11. So the U.S.'s mission was crystal clear: target Al-Qaeda and dismantle that entire terrorist network.
So completely different motivations at play here. One was about maneuvering during this global ideological standoff, and the other was a direct response to a devastating attack.
Exactly. And those different motives, and well, they had a huge impact on how each superpower actually, approached the conflict, especially when it came to their military strategies.
Right, let's talk tactics. Soviets, it seems like they just went in guns blazing, like a classic shock and awe kind of thing, right?
Totally. They relied heavily on their conventional military power. They had massive troop deployments, heavy artillery, airstrikes all over the place. Their whole strategy was to just crush any resistance with pure firepower.
But Afghanistan, well, it's got a bit of a reputation, right? They don't call it the graveyard of empires for nothing.
You got that right. Afghanistan's terrain, it's notoriously difficult. Mountains, valleys, caves, it's like a maze. Perfect for guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run tactics, blending in. The Mujahideen, they knew that terrain like the back of their hands, and they used it to their advantage.
So the Soviets' heavy-handed approach, all those tanks and artillery, they were actually more of a hindrance in that kind of environment.
You could say that. Their big show of force kind of backfired. Instead of a quick win, they found themselves stuck in this long, drawn-out conflict, fighting an enemy that was resilient and adaptable.
And I imagine their tactics probably didn't win over the locals either.
No, not at all. All that heavy-handed stuff, the bombings, the destruction, it just pushed more people towards the Mujahideen. Classic example of how brute force can really backfire in a situation like that.
So then fast forward to 2001, the U.S. enters the scene. And they take a completely different approach, right?
Yeah.
After 9/11, it was laser focus, eliminate al-Qaeda. I remember all the talk back then about targeted strikes, special forces operating in the shadows.
Yes, the initial U.S. strategy, it was worlds apart from the Soviet approach. They went for what they called a light footprint, emphasis on precision, not overwhelming force. So targeted airstrikes using advanced tech to try and minimize civilian casualties. Plus, small, highly trained special forces units working with local Afghan allies.
So it was more about like surgical strikes, going after specific targets instead of just carpet bombing whole areas.
Exactly. And who they chose to partner with, that was really important too. They linked up with the Northern Alliance, a group that had been fighting the Taliban for years. That collaboration, it gave them access to local knowledge, people who knew the lay of the land.
Sounds like a much more calculated approach compared to the Soviets' brute force tactics.
Yeah.
But did it work? I mean, we know this conflict dragged on for years, just like the Soviet intervention.
It's true. The U.S., they did manage to topple the Taliban regime pretty quickly. But as the conflict went on, things got a lot more complicated.
Right, because their whole mission changed, didn't it? It went from purely counterterrorism to something much broader, nation-building.
You hit the nail on the head. The U.S. found itself pulled into this incredibly complex and ambitious project, rebuilding Afghanistan from the ground up, creating a stable, democratic government, trying to foster a whole new Afghan society.
So the U.S., they basically shifted from being a warrior to being a builder. And that probably came with a whole new set of challenges. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Nation building, it's a long, tough process, especially in a place like Afghanistan with all its history, tribal dynamics, deep-seated divisions. The U.S. was facing a massive task, and that transition from a military mission to nation building, well, it was a major turning point in the whole conflict.
And that's something we'll definitely dig deeper into as we continue our deep dive.
Definitely. We've only just scratched the surface of this story. It's complex and multifaceted. So this whole nation building thing, you're probably wondering how it actually worked on the ground, right?
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't just about sending in troops, was it?
No, it was way more than that. You had this massive influx of aid money, tons of it. Then there were all these efforts to set up democratic institutions, even programs to promote women's rights and education.
It sounds like a monumental task, like trying to rebuild a whole country while also fighting this resurgent Taliban. That must have been incredibly difficult.
Oh, it was a juggling act for sure. The U.S., they were trying to balance those counterterrorism goals with their, nation-building dreams. And this whole balancing act, it led to a ton of debate and criticism, both within the U.S. and internationally.
So even though the initial intervention had all this global support, the longer the U.S. stayed in Afghanistan, the more that support started to fade away.
Exactly. The war on terror, it had this very clear narrative, this focus on, immediate threats. But nation building, that's a long game. And there's no guarantee of winning. Public opinion in the U.S., it started to shift as the war dragged on. The costs kept piling up, and victory, well, it just seemed further and further away.
It's like people were starting to ask, what are we actually fighting for here? Which brings us back to the human cost of all of this, right? I mean, for the Afghan people caught in the middle of these global power struggles, it must felt like this never-ending cycle of conflict.
Absolutely. The Afghan people, they paid the heaviest price in both interventions. Think about it. Decades of war, displacement, losing loved ones. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's so important to remember that behind all the geopolitics and military stuff, there were real people whose lives were completely turned upside down.
Can we talk about that human cost a bit more? What were the specific consequences for civilians during both the Soviet and American interventions?
Well, under the Soviets, you had entire villages being wiped out, sometimes intentionally, as this brutal tactic to break the resistance. Millions were killed or injured, either directly in the fighting or because of the war's impact on healthcare and infrastructure. And millions more, they fled the country, becoming refugees. Man, that's just a stark reminder of how devastating war is for civilians. And those scars, that trauma, it doesn't just disappear, does it?
Not at all. The psychological and emotional toll of conflict, it can last for generations. You hear the stories from people who lived through those times, and it's haunting. Fear, loss, but also this amazing resilience.
And what about during the American intervention? We talked about their light footprint approach, but even precision strikes can go wrong. And then there's that whole issue of drone warfare, which became a big part of the U.S. strategy.
Yeah, you're right. Even though the U.S. was trying to minimize civilian casualties, a lot of Afghans still died. Insurgent attacks, drone strikes, urban warfare, it all took a toll. And beyond the immediate deaths and injuries, the war shattered the country's infrastructure, crippled the economy, even with billions of dollars in international aid.
It's almost like a paradox, isn't it? The U.S. goes in wanting to help rebuild Afghanistan, but in the process, they cause more destruction and suffering.
It really shows you how complex and contradictory foreign intervention can be. Even with good intentions, there's always the risk of unintended consequences. And those consequences, they can have a ripple effect, impacting generations to come.
Okay, so we've talked about the human cost, the different motivations behind the interventions, the military tactics. But let's not forget about the rest of the world. How did other countries react to these two interventions? I'm guessing the responses were pretty different, given the historical context.
You're spot on. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, it was met with international condemnation, especially from the U.S. and its allies. They saw it as this blatant act of aggression, a violation of international law, a dangerous expansion of Soviet influence.
So it fed right into that whole Cold War narrative of good versus evil, democracy versus communism.
Exactly. The U.S., they jumped at the chance to put pressure on the Soviets, diplomatically, but also through covert ops. Remember Operation Cyclone? The U.S. funneled huge amounts of money and weapons to the Mujahideen, basically using them to weaken the Soviets.
That's kind of ironic, isn't it? The U.S. arming and supporting the same groups that would later become their enemies.
Yeah, history's full of twists like that. Back then, in the middle of the Cold War, the U.S. saw the Mujahideen as freedom fighters, resisting Soviet aggression. The long-term consequences, the rise of extremist groups, the future threat of terrorism, well, those weren't really on the radar at the time.
So the Soviet invasion was condemned by the world. But what about the U.S. intervention in 2001? The world was a very different place after 9/11. There was a lot of sympathy for the U.S.
Yeah, right after 9/11, the response to the U.S. intervention was overwhelmingly supportive. Those attacks had shocked everyone. Many countries saw what the U.S. was doing in Afghanistan as justified. It was seen as a response to terrorism. NATO even invoked Article 5 for the first time, which meant collective defense against a common enemy.
So a united front against terrorism. But that unity, as we know, didn't last forever.
Nope. As the war in Afghanistan dragged on and the U.S. shifted from counterterrorism to nation-building, international support started to drop. Public opinion in a lot of countries, even the U.S., it soured. The war was becoming too costly, both in terms of lives and money.
Sounds like a familiar pattern. The longer a foreign intervention lasts, the harder it is to keep public and international support.
There's a reason why people call Afghanistan the graveyard of empires. It's a country that has defied outside powers over and over again, both the Soviets and the Americans. Their interventions show you how dangerous it is to underestimate Afghan society and the resilience of the Afghan people.
Speaking of empires, the war in Afghanistan is often blamed for the Soviet Union's collapse. Is that a fair assessment?
That war, it definitely took a huge toll on the Soviet Union, drained their resources both financially and militarily. Their troops were demoralized, facing this fierce enemy in the Mujahideen, and it exposed all these weaknesses in their military and political system. Think of it like a wound that never really healed, weakening them from the inside.
So a major blow, but maybe not the only thing that brought down the Soviet Empire.
Right, the Soviet Union was already struggling with a ton of internal problems. The economy was a mess, there was political corruption, and unrest was growing in their republics. The war in Afghanistan just made all those problems worse, added to the strain, and sped up their downfall, like pouring gasoline on a fire that was already burning.
And what about the U.S. side of things? What lessons can we learn from their longest war? After 2 decades in Afghanistan, what are the key takeaways?
The U.S. experience, it shows us just how complicated and limited foreign intervention can be. Highlights the need for crystal clear objectives, a solid exit strategy, and really understanding the local context. Nation building, it's not a quick fix. Military solutions alone can't solve deep-rooted social and political problems.
It's a cautionary tale, isn't it? About the limits of American power and the arrogance of thinking we can remake other countries in our own image.
I think that's a pretty fair assessment. The U.S., they went into Afghanistan with good intentions, at least at the beginning, but they underestimated the challenges, overestimated their ability to create lasting change, and ended up tangled in a conflict with no easy answers. The withdrawal in 2021, it left a lot of people wondering what had actually been accomplished after 2 decades of war.
So we have 2 superpowers, 2 interventions, and 2 cautionary tales. But what about Afghanistan itself? What's the lasting impact on the Afghan people?
The Afghan people have been through unimaginable suffering over the past few decades. Caught in the middle of these global power struggles, their country has been devastated by war and instability. But through it all, they've shown incredible resilience, a determination to rebuild their lives.
It's a story of both tragedy and resilience, isn't it?
Exactly. It's a reminder that while superpowers might come and go, it's the people who are left to deal with the consequences. And in the case of Afghanistan, those consequences have been profound.
It's clear that Afghanistan's story is like this mix of resilience and tragedy. But looking back at these two interventions, what do you think is the biggest takeaway? What's the most important lesson we can learn?
For me, it's got to be the incredible resilience of the Afghan people. Think about it. They faced decades of war, people being forced from their homes, political turmoil, but they always come back with this determination to rebuild their lives, their communities. It's really amazing how the human spirit can endure and adapt, even when things are just unbelievably tough.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's so easy to get caught up in all the global power plays and the military strategies and political arguments. But we can't forget about the human side of it all. The Afghan people, they're the ones who have really borne the brunt of these interventions. It's a reminder that these big foreign policy decisions, they have real consequences for people on the ground.
Exactly. And it shows us that we need a bit of humility in foreign policy. Both the Soviets and the Americans, they had all this military power, all these resources, and in the end, they couldn't achieve their goals in Afghanistan. They underestimated Afghans, the strength of local resistance, how complex Afghan society really is, and they didn't see all the unintended consequences that would come from their actions.
It's a cautionary tale, for sure, about the limits of power and how important it is to understand the local context, all the nuances.
It's like you can't just come in with a one-size-fits-all approach, right?
Yeah.
Especially in a place like Afghanistan, there are no easy solutions.
Absolutely. And just imposing solutions from the outside, even if you mean well, it rarely works. It rarely leads to lasting peace or stability.
It's clear that the Afghan people have paid a heavy price because of these interventions. Decades of war, displacement, instability. It's a lot to bear.
It really is. But their story, it's also a call to action. We can't just forget about Afghanistan now that the U.S. is withdrawn. We owe it to the Afghan people to support them in their efforts to find peace, to build a stable future, to decide their own fate.
We have a responsibility, right, to learn from the mistakes of the past so we don't repeat them. The interventions in Afghanistan, they teach us a lot about the limits of power, how complex the nation building is, and how our actions can have unintended consequences. We need to remember these lessons, especially as the world gets more complex and interconnected.
Well said. This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. It's a story that shows us the resilience of the human spirit, but also the unintended consequences of our actions, and how important it is to approach global challenges with humility and a real understanding of what's happening on the ground. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll see you on our next deep dive.